have a fantastic morning planned. We have a special guest who will be introduced in a little bit, okay? You guys have one job right now, okay? I did notice that our visitor is wearing socks, right? So your job today is to knock those socks off as you rise and join us in our opening hymn. Here we go.
We acknowledge that we are situated on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4 territory. These are the territories of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Beaches Nation.
We respect and honor the treaties that are made on all territories. We acknowledge all nations, indigenous and non-indigenous, who live, work, and play on this land.
All together, please, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Just take a second. Think of somebody you'd like to offer this prayer up for. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. All right, please have a seat. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, House. One of the things we've been doing at Notre Dame for over 103 years since Notre Dame began, Lady of the Prairies, is we bring in guest speakers, guests who have something to share from things that I think are important. So we call this the informal curriculum. So anytime we bring in a speaker, it's an informal curriculum. The things you learn in the classroom are the formal curriculum. So on that note, I'm going to bring Robert back up and he's going to introduce our guest.
All right. So it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Archbishop Donald Bolen. Donald Bolen is the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Regina. He was born on the Canadian prairies, studied in Regina, Ottawa, and Oxford, and after ordination, taught in the Religious Studies Department at Campeen College at the University of Regina. Here he engaged in parish ministry. In 2001, he was appointed to work at the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity under Cardinal Walter Casper. In that capacity, he had the opportunity to serve the Catholic Church's international dialogues with Anglicans and Methodists. He was named the Bishop of the Diocese of Saskatoon in 2010 and the Archbishop of Regina in 2016. Within the Canadian Conference for Catholic Bishops, he has been active in ecumenical and justice work. On both diocesan and national levels, he has been actively involved in Indigenous relations and responding to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So on that note, as I set up, can you give us a round of applause to welcome our guest speaker?
Thanks very much. So, very good to be with you. Thanks for the gift of this last time I came out here. Wear it quite a bit when I go out in the garden, so I thought I'd stick it on this morning. Thanks for spending the time and for dedicating the time to this morning. So I got my watch over there, but somebody's going to have to give me a heads up when it's about 9:20 and then I'll wind up. What time is it now? 8:50, got a half an hour. So I was basically asked to come and talk about Pope Francis's visit to Canada and the path he put us on in terms of new relationship between the Church and Indigenous peoples in this land. And I think that visit of the Pope is probably one of the most important moments in the history of the Church in Canada, perhaps the most important moment in the history of the Church in Canada, and one of the most important moments in the history of this country, because it really caused us, asked us, challenged us to reinterpret the way we tell history in this country. The residential school system was so deeply embedded. Catholics had this understanding that everything that the missionaries came and did was all good, and that has, I guess we've woken to a new understanding of that history today. As we've listened to Indigenous people, listened to survivors of residential schools, listened to them tell the stories, and then hear the trauma and see the legacy of the residential school system showing forth in all kinds of ways today. And so society as a whole and the Church has had to rethink its understanding of itself and its understanding of history, and to start listening to history from an Indigenous perspective, and to hear what happened with colonization and with the Indian Act and with the establishment of residential schools. So when the Truth and Reconciliation final report came out in 2015, one of the calls to action, a number of the calls to action were directed to the churches. Really, you read I don't know if you've had a chance to read anything of the Truth and Reconciliation report, but so much pain and suffering, and different kinds of abuse that were suffered, and you kind of get to a place in that text where you just think the authors are going to say, we want nothing to do with Christian churches, but they don't say that. They don't say that. They say Christian churches and the rest of society needs to make changes and needs to acknowledge the past, needs to become allies of Indigenous people in the search for justice, needs to be with us and supportive of us and listening deeply to us. So those calls to action, 94 calls to action, several of them, 8 were addressed to all the Christian churches that were involved in residential schools, and one in particular to Catholics. It was asking the Pope to come to Canada and offer an apology to Indigenous peoples for the Church's role in residential schools, and for him to do it on Canadian soil, preferably within a year, right? It took 7 years for it to happen, but a lot of steps happened along the way. So in April, end of March, April of this year, a first step was taken where a delegation of First Nations and Métis and Inuit survivors and elders and youth and leaders came to Rome. I was privileged to be a part of that. And each group had a meeting with the Pope, and they got a chance to share with him their own experience and the pain that their people have lived through, and the role of the Church in that history. And they spoke very openly and from the heart And the Pope received it and offered a profound apology in each of those meetings, and then when we gathered together on April 1st. And it was a very powerful event. For all those, I think, who took part, it was a fairly transformative experience. But for people who were watching it on television or reading it, it didn't have the same impact. And we realized the difference between following something by media and actually being there and seeing the Pope listening deeply to you and responding emotionally. One of the powerful moments of the visit to Rome was somebody from Saskatchewan. There was a few people from Saskatchewan that were heavily involved, but Chief Marianne Baywalker-Peltier was the chief at Okanese in File Hill, so probably about an hour and a quarter from here, the other side of Regina. And she presented the Pope with two little pairs of moccasins, small children's moccasins, as a symbol of the children who died in residential schools, who were lost, who suffered so deeply. And she asked the Pope to take those moccasins and to keep them until he came to Canada, and to bring them back as a symbol of trying to restore some sense of responsibility and some sense of hope for the children who were in residential schools. There was quite a beautiful celebration in St. Peter's Square, just a spontaneous celebration after the Pope spoke and after he apologized. And there was a Saskatchewan dancer from Carry the Kettle, Kevin Haywehe, and he danced in the presence of the Pope, and then danced in St. Peter's Square, and a little spontaneous round dance formed in the middle of St. Peter's Square at the Vatican, and it was a wonderful moment of kind of joy, cathartic joy, after the intensity of that experience. But for those who weren't there, it was not enough, and we knew that we wanted the Pope to come to Canada. The Pope wanted to come to Canada. So it happened. It happened, and we were pretty nervous that it wouldn't happen because he had to cancel some trips because his health is very poor. He can barely walk. He can't really walk without help. He can barely stand. But he was determined and wanted to come, and the bishops and the people of Canada wanted him to come, especially many Indigenous people wanted him to come and make that apology. So, thanks be to God, he came. And I imagine you followed some of the news coverage of it because it was the main story in the country for a few days, certainly in the lead up to it. And I would say that out of the Pope's visit, he really, I think he took part in the whole thing, and even had a chance to speak before the Pope came out at Massachusett with two survivors from Saskatchewan. But you follow the events one at a time, and the media had their scrutiny of every particular event. But now it's in the past. It's 3 months ago, 2-3 months ago, and we're starting to see the event as a whole, and the texts, the speeches he gave, and we can read those as a whole. And there's a real roadmap forward out of that papal visit. What we tried to do as bishops was to feed into the Pope what we were learning and hearing from survivors, from those who had attended residential schools. So I was one of the ones who had the privilege of passing information. Here is what survivors need to hear. Here's where they're saying we need to go in the future. And I think he really followed that advice. So I'd like to map out four ways forward that we heard from survivors, and we heard clearly from the Pope during the course of his visit. And I'll go through those four, and then I'll offer a little challenge for you and be ready to respond to any questions as time allows. So the first was clearly the request for truth-telling, right? The church and society as a whole needs to be honest and clear about what happened in residential schools and the way in which Indigenous communities experienced the deep trauma. So acknowledging the various kinds of abuse that took place, but acknowledging that the system itself was destructive for Indigenous language and culture and spirituality and worldview and community. The system took children from their families, separated them. The system denigrated Indigenous language and culture. It functioned with a sense of superiority of European ways, that would be better for the people. That was a deeply faulty and unjust assumption. So the Pope came and clearly and strongly and repeatedly offered apology for the Catholic Church's involvement in the residential school system and for the abuses that were suffered there. He said at one point at Masquachis, the first event, he said, while there were many people who no doubt tried to serve and do well, do good, and care for students in the context of those schools, and there were, every survivor survivors will share stories that were positive. He said the system itself was catastrophic. It's such a strong word, but it's a deep acknowledgement that any system which deprives people of their language, culture, and spirituality, which breaks up their families and takes away their worldview, is profoundly unjust, and it's going to leave people with a deep sense of trauma. And part of the truth-telling is telling that story and telling it in a way that starts to bring healing and starts to bring reconciliation. Part of the truth-telling is asked of the Catholic Church is to draw on any archival materials that we have. And you see quite a bit of that in the media about archives. Draw on archival material that we have that might help tell the story. We've been asked as a diocese for everything we have in terms of lists of priests, religious students, birth records, death records that might help trace who was present at the residential school and what happened to them, right? So we've tried to offer whatever assistance we could, and we sent a lot of archives to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. But the archival work is part of telling the story. A lot of First Nations communities, I think of a community like Kisikus, north of Kamsak, is trying to write their history and asking for our help in doing so. So there were a couple of residential schools on that territory. So truth-telling. And truth-telling involves reinterpreting the past, right? It involves an honest telling of history. And that's a task that really goes in strongly to educational systems. Schools, residential school system was about education. It was about schools. And schools today, Catholic schools, have a special role in changing that and telling the story in a truthful way, in a way that is responsible and respectful. So that was a first and a major area that survivors were looking for, and where the Pope came through. I think one survivor was telling me, not just any apology is okay, and he talked about the anatomy of an apology. What components make an apology a good one? It's not like, oh, I'm sorry that you feel like you were hurt by what I did, right? It's a deep acknowledgement of what happened, an acknowledgement, taking of responsibility, a compassionate recognition of the suffering that was involved, and that it doesn't end with words, but rather it leads to action towards making changes and doing things differently. So the other three steps here are really part of an action plan going forward, along with that truth-telling. So the next one of those has got to do with Indigenous language and culture and ceremonies and traditions, and spirituality. So acknowledging that those were denigrated and suppressed and taken away in many ways from Indigenous people, but acknowledging also the strength and robustness of many Indigenous communities where those things have survived, where there are still Indigenous ceremonies, where the Indigenous worldview is still taught and passed on by elders and knowledge keepers to others. There are still Cree speakers in the country, not as many as there should be. But part of the task is acknowledging what was taken away and then being an ally in the fostering of Indigenous language and culture and traditions, the support or strengthening of those. So, in various ways, the church is being asked to be a support in that regard. So, I don't think you teach Cree here, but there are schools in the Catholic system where Cree is taught. There's one school in the Saskatoon which is basically a Cree school, which is a really powerful undertaking, so that Cree-speaking kids who come from a Cree First Nation are able to go to school in their own language and learn it and be able to be very articulate in it. And that's languages are so important because they carry traditions and cultures. They carry a worldview. We express our world and ourselves and our emotions and our identity through a language. So being able to get those languages back and strong is a really important thing. There are ways in which the Catholic Church is being asked to be a support in the recovery of Indigenous culture and traditions. Ceremonies were suppressed by the government. I remember a few years ago being brought by a respected elder, Noel Starblanket, being invited to the Sundance and his First Nation community. And it was a really powerful experience and a beautiful experience. And it was tragic to be mindful that the government had suppressed that ceremony, that the church had supported the suppression of that ceremony. It was powerful. It was identity grounding. It was life-giving. It was profoundly meaningful, had beautiful values. So how can we support Indigenous communities as they try to hold on to or recover traditions and ceremonies and worldview? I'll say more about the worldview when I get to the fourth point. But it's a real key there. The third area has to do with Indigenous rights. The inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. So survivors, one survivor that I work very closely with is a fellow named Ted Cusance from Kisiku's First Nation. Another is Susan Bowden, who's from Cowsis. They speak often about the systemic injustice in our country and the need to support Indigenous people in their pursuit, their rightful pursuit of justice. So here we look at a couple of things. There is a document called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a long title for a document that's not that long. It takes 15 or 20 minutes to read it. I think it would be a great thing if everybody who graduated from a high school in this province had a chance to read and study a little bit the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a roadmap to create societies where justice flourishes for Indigenous people and for all. Now, the Catholic Church has officially endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which calls for self-determination and self-government, the right for education systems, the right to preserve language and culture, the right to land, just settlements for land. So, but I sometimes say that saying I agree with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is like saying I agree with the Beatitudes or I agree with the Sermon on the Mount. It's easy to say I agree, but it's quite different to be challenged at the depths of our societal structures by what that document says. It's like it's hard to face the challenges that the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount address to us as persons. So that document is a very good roadmap going forward. I think that we can look at two categories here of activities in relation to the search for justice. First, we can look at the systemic injustice in our society, that access to education and access to health, poverty rates, access to drinking water, is not equal in this country, and that Indigenous communities often are on the losing end in that regard, and have a greater challenge at accessing basic resources that the rest of us can take for granted. And then there is the legacy of the residential school system, which shows itself in the terribly high incarceration rates, the addiction rates that are such a challenge on so many First Nations communities. So how do we address the systemic injustice and the trauma that's passed on from generation to generation and be true allies to Indigenous people in their rightful pursuit of justice in this country? So the Pope named that. The Pope spoke about the UN Declaration. He spoke about the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. And he said, it's quite a shame in a country like Canada where there is such inequality and injustice embedded in it. That's my words, not his, but his words were pretty close to that in Quebec City, right? He really challenged us as a country. We've got work to do. Canada likes to present itself as this nation that embodies justice, but said your track record is very poor when it comes to the way in which Indigenous people are treated in this country. So there's a significant work to be done in terms of being an ally in the rightful pursuit of justice. That's a societal work, it's a work for the church, it's a work where Indigenous people clearly need to be in the lead, and there are such strong Indigenous leaders today who are, I think, the strongest leaders in the country. I had the chance in that visit to Rome, and again, the Pope's visit, to meet some of those leaders. Chief Cadmus Delorme from Cowessess is one of those leaders. The Inuit leader, Natan Obed, I wish he was the next Prime Minister. He was just such an articulate, passionate, wise leader. Cassidy Caron, the leader of the Métis. And there's great leaders there who can lead, and the rest of the country, with the support of Christian churches and other faith communities, can follow, so that we do build a society where justice flourishes. The Catholic Church has a strong social teaching which calls for justice, and the UN Declaration aligns with what the Catholic social teaching calls for. It's just easy to talk about this stuff in general, but getting into the details and how you be an ally in that regard. There's big work for us and before us, and the Pope really invited us to take that on. The last area that we heard from survivors was a true recognition of the wisdom of Indigenous understanding of the land and creation, and the relationship with the Creator and relationship with other creatures, and the beauty of those traditions and that worldview, and how much the world needs to learn from that worldview. So the Pope spoke eloquently about the wisdom of Indigenous ways, about how Indigenous peoples have safeguarded the land and lived on the land in a good and a sustainable way, where the Western world, following a materialist path, has created conflict and inequality. Indigenous ways of living on the land were sustainable and life-giving. He talked openly about Indigenous worldview, cultures and traditions as carrying so much wisdom about families, about caring for elderly, about caring for young people, about the relationship between the old and the young, about how to live as a family and as a community which really supports each other. I have a little story to interrupt on that one, but I was, I firmly believe this. And the Indigenous, my friend Susan Bolen will sometimes say, culture is beautiful, and she helps me to see it and to really rejoice in it and to celebrate it. And the sense of hospitality and the care for others. But anyway, I was driving up to Kisikus for a confirmation service about 2 months ago, 3 months ago. And I had a driver, and the driver was tired, but I was tired, and I was working on a homily as well. So we stopped for a coffee. Anyway, we kept going, and my driver fell asleep at the wheel, and we were lucky. So we slid off the road, we slid sideways, we slid back across the road, we spun around, but we didn't flip. Tires were shredded, but the car was fine, and we were fine. But clearly not able to go anywhere. And over the course of 10 or 15 minutes before someone came to pick me up, 6 different vehicles stopped to check out if we were okay. And 5 of the drivers and people of those vehicles were First Nation people. And I thought, that really speaks a great story. There's a tradition and a sense of when someone's in need, you reach out. And in our Western world, there's often a sense of, well, it's not my business, it's not my problem. Well, it is our problem if we want to live as a community. So the Pope highlighted the richness and the beauty of Indigenous ways and how those need to be supported. And he goes further and he talks about how our Western society is really on a self-destructive path, which doesn't pay attention to inequalities, doesn't pay attention to the poor, doesn't pay attention to the environment. And Indigenous people do. And there's an Indigenous wisdom which really we all need if we're going to find a way to go forward on this planet. So the Pope, I think, really gave us in those 4 ways a roadmap. And last thing I'll say was, he talked about the importance of big gestures, and by big gesture he means like a papal trip to Canada to offer an apology. But he said real change largely happens not by documents and not by visits, but on the ground, in local building of relations, in establishing of friendships, in finding ways to work together, in finding ways to learn about each other. I know a lot of that happens here, and I know a lot of it happens on the ground in all kinds of places where we are building a different kind of future. But the Pope really put it to us, it's not something that one visit and one apology and one set of documents can accomplish. This is a challenge for all of us to find a new way of living together, walking together in right relationship, walking together in a good way. And there's so much to benefit, not only for Indigenous people, but for all of us as a society, if we could learn to live together in a good, right way, which really respects our relationship with each other, respects each other's traditions, respects the natural world, respects the other creatures and the land on which we live, and not function with such a sense of this is mine. I like that question about what was the biggest, most expensive thing I owned. But that's a Western preoccupation, isn't it? I mean, how much stuff do we have? But stuff doesn't really bring us a deep and abiding joy, whereas relationships do. Living together in community, that is a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a vision. Those things bring life. So I think I would be happy to hear any questions or comments that you would have at this time. How are we doing time-wise? 9:20 exactly. So it's 5 minutes for questions if any of you have. Don't feel any pressure. Okay, Father Parker.
I'll help break the ice then. You talked about how one of the goals of the church will be to find concrete ways that we can live this kind of call to justice and this call to growing together as different communities, or the same community but with maybe different origins in that. But what are some concrete ways that maybe we can right now that you think work towards those things?
Great. Well, let me answer the question from a diocesan level and then maybe from Wilcox and Notre Dame level, right? On a diocesan level, right? We got to build relations with First Nations and Métis communities and start conversations with chiefs and elders and knowledge keepers and survivors and youth communities and say, how can we walk in solidarity with you? And when we get invited to powwows or ceremonies to go, to deepen that, our understanding of the richness of those traditions and to celebrate them, when we get invited to enter into dialogue or to be an ally on a particular issue, to take it up. I think for parishes, this is something some of you might have done, a blanket exercise, which helps us understand the history better. Elders and survivors are often ready to come and speak in parishes, taking part in events like the celebrations that will take place on the 30th for National Truth and Reconciliation Day. Those are steps. But wherever we can build relationships, that's key. I think for the school system, we can take those steps by highlighting issues that are really important for First Nations people and asking, studying those and looking at them closely and asking, what does it mean for us as a society to be an ally in that pursuit of justice, or an ally in that effort to recover traditions and spirituality and language? I think another piece of it is, we're Catholic, and part of being Catholic means having a desire to enter into respectful dialogue with other spiritual traditions. Not just to convert, but to get to know each other, to learn about the things that we hold in common. One of the projects that I'm involved in is an Indigenous spirituality church dialogue, where we've really learned about distinct elements of each, but learned about all that we hold in common. The Anishinaabe grandfather teachings sound very much like a list of Catholic values: humility and truth and compassion, love, justice. So anyway, I think those are some of the ways in which we can undertake the next steps of really engaging. So I really wish to encourage you on this path. There's a lot of life and a societal need for transformation, and it's going to happen with your generation in the lead, where you've got a deeper understanding of history, a truthful understanding of history that some older folks didn't get, and you can be protagonists of change. So God bless you, perseverance to you, and thanks for the invitation and the welcome.
Your Grace, so if you're wondering, that's how we officially address the Archbishop. Anyway, Your Grace, just a sincere thank you for the sharing, and as the representative of our school, there's a willingness, but we know we're behind. We know we need to address the actions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but make them real and meaningful. And so the good news is we're on that journey. But a sincere thank you for sharing the message. I don't know, the Hounds, I love the church, so I pay close attention to what goes on in the church. And the church is our family. And the bishop is a successor of the apostles. So Jesus chose 12 apostles, okay? And then before they died, they appointed or successors. So our Archbishop is a successor of the apostles. So we have over 2,000 years of apostolic tradition. That's what it means. But the bishop is also our spiritual father. And here's what I'm getting. I've been watching Archbishop Don over the past couple decades. And just some of the things you got to endure from the media on behalf of the church is truly courageous. And you always do it in a humble manner. And today's reading, I was thinking of you when St. Paul says, I beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you've been called, with humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace in us. So, good on you, because that's what I thought about when I thought about you, and this is a great description of Archbishop Don. But just, we want to thank you for being a witness to hope, for being an authentic example of a Christian disciple, and for having the humility to be our spiritual father, along with Father Parker, too. We have a couple of spiritual fathers. Anyway, Phoebe's going to come up with a little...
Grace. Hi, my name is Phoebe Roberts. I'm a four-year hound from Sydney, Australia. On behalf of the Notre Dame family, we thank you today for your presence and your humble sharings. Please accept this gift as a sign of our gratitude.
So thank you guys for being a great audience, and now we're just kind of in our last couple minutes. We're going to rise for the Lord's Prayer and our closing hymn. Right, all together. Our Father.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.
All right, so have a fantastic day. Are we ready on the keyboard? Here we go.
Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. When you move, I'll move. I will follow. All your ways are good. All your ways are sure. I will trust in you alone. Higher than my sight, high above my mind. I will trust in you alone. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. When you move,